So it is my great pleasure to have Professor Isak Ladegaard from Hong Kong University, who does amazing work at the intersection of criminology, sociology, and technology. And he also recently published this book called Open Secrecy, which really looks at a combination of qualitative research, very deep qualitative research with computational quantitative methods to really understand the digital underground. And this really helps us to understand the status of interactions between digital powers and also the state. Because I think especially the common understanding we have about digital platforms and digital forces are usually the idea that there's a sort of a marriage between the state and big tech platforms, that sometimes these big digital platforms were co-opted by the state and even used by the state to perform a lot of functions. But Isak's work, very importantly, provide the idea that there has been some, areas that the state power has not able to penetrate. And this is fascinating and adds to our understanding about the next phase of development. So without further ado, let's welcome Isak to give us this amazing presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Sorry about the lunch. So the title of the presentation is Platforms Against the State. And this is really a working paper based on research I did for the book. And a key idea in this working paper is that, and this referred to this, that administrative technology, so writing, bookkeeping, really basic early information technology, enabled statecraft, enabled large-scale population management. And there's a growing literature on how big tech companies have similar administrative capabilities and how state power is being reconfigured in part because of other entities having state-like powers, okay? And my addition to this literature is to dig underground and talk about how platform technology and administrative technology in general empowers the underground as well, which contributes to another form of state contestation. So in this talk, I ask, how do shadowy platforms operate in hostile regulatory environments? And I call them shadowy. I could have used the word deviant. We try not to use that word anymore because it implies a moral judgment. I could use illegal platforms, but they're not always illegal. Sometimes they're controversial and anti-social, but technically not illegal. So I ended up with the word shadowy platforms. So how do shadowy platforms operate in hostile regulatory environments? So this is the topic for the book. And in the book, I have 3 cases: digital drug trade, censorship circumvention in China, and the digital far right in the United States. So you might ask why those 3 cases are quite different in many ways, right? There are a few reasons. So one reason is that these 3 cases in different ways bring attention to how platform technology is liberatory. And of course, liberatory has positive connotations, but I want to bring attention to how the liberatory consequences of information technology are not necessarily pro-social or anti-social. So these 3 entities are challenged by very different forces, but they are very powerful forces, right? So the drug markets that are written about are challenged by Western law enforcement, so think FBI, the NCA. Censorship circumvention in China is challenged by the CCP, to simplify, and the digital far right, which is primarily based on hosting infrastructure in the United States, where it's technically legal, is challenged by big technology companies. So by talking about these 3 cases and how they're able to survive the pushback from very, very powerful forces, that tells us something about how liberatory the platform technology really can be, and how to what degree these entities are empowered by platform technology. Okay, and I also have these three cases because they bring attention to, and I mentioned, or I alluded to this already. It brings attention to how the liberatory forces of platform technology is neither good nor bad, or it's both, right? So my argument is not a normative argument. I'm not saying this is a good development or a bad development. You could think differently about these three cases, right? But in my mind, these are sort of the good guys. These are the bad guys, and I have mixed feelings about the drug markets, but happy to talk more about that later. But the point is that it's not a normative argument that I'm making here. And today's focus will be on two shadowy platforms. This is just to save time, really, but and the focus will be on continuation, so how these platforms are able to operate. So it's not really about how they're created, but how actors are able to keep things going. And I bring attention to that because creating and maintaining socioeconomic projects are really distinct challenges. So there are overlaps, of course, but keeping things going has distinct challenges. And this is particularly true for legally or socially contested domains, which are typically characterized by disorder. So I mentioned that I'll talk about two shadowy platforms, and I will cycle back and forth between the two. So the first case I'll talk about, or one of the two I'll talk about, is a community for developers who make software that makes it easy to access the open internet in mainland China, where the Great Firewall is constructed to impair that kind of access, right? So that's the first platform I'll talk about. The second one, and I'll start by talking about that just now. Second one is a social network for the far right, and it's hosted in the United States. Most of the users are American as well. And I'll start talking about the digital far right, but I'll cycle back and forth between the two. So the far right platform that I'll be talking about is Gab. This is the mascot of Gab. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a green frog actually ended up being a far right meme. So there are some logic behind that particular visual appearance. So Gab has hundreds of thousands of members. I think it's now more than 1 million, but many of the users are not necessarily active. But in 2021, at least 400,000 members were active, so they were real members. And Gab is clearly an anti-social project, and I have 3 examples of that. So in 2017, Gab was used to organize the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And in 2018, a Gab member posted numerous anti-Semitic messages on Gab before he walked into a synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed 11 worshippers there. And in 2021, Gab was used to organize the siege of the US Capitol. Gab was not the only platform that was used for that, of course, but it was instrumental in providing a space for people to organize in public. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier that Gab is technically legal, but it's still regulated by the state. It's regulated indirectly by the state through ambiguous corporate laws and outsourced policing. And I'll give you a few examples of that. So in response to the 3 events that I just talked about, the big technology firms that many online services depend on, they stopped working with Gab, so they deplatformed Gab. And recall, a question for today is, how do shadowy platforms operate in hostile regulatory environments? So one empirical question here is, did Gab lose its ability to recruit members, which is really its bread and butter? To find out, I measured GAB recruitment after 2 of the 3 events. I actually measured after all 3 events, but I'll focus on 2 to save time for today. So the first one I'll talk about is after the synagogue terror in 2019, when GAB was banned by numerous payment and hosting services, including Visa and MasterCard and PayPal and Stripe and Microsoft and GoDaddy and so on. So we're looking at member recruitment, remember, right? So here we're looking at the daily count of new signups on GAB based on past observations of daily signups. The white line is where we would expect daily signups to be if there was no intervention, okay? But the Pittsburgh terrorist attack happened right here, right? So the question is, was GAB able to maintain member recruitment despite big technology companies ceasing operations or ceasing working with GAB? This is what I found. So you can tell that GAB was taken offline for a few days. Hosting providers stopped working with GAB. You had to relocate its hosting, move its data, and so on. But it came back online, and on the whole, daily signups increased a little bit in this particular time period. But the point is not so much how much it increased or decreased potentially. It's more about, was GAB able to maintain its operations? Was it able to keep going, keep recruiting members? That's really the empirical question, right? And the evidence suggests that it was. The second case I'll talk about is after the Capitol siege in 2021. And this is a few years later, right? A few years after the Pittsburgh synagogue attack. So all the tech companies I mentioned, they are still not working with GAB. And GAB has had to reconstruct its hosting infrastructure, basically, and figure out how to operate a large social media platform without depending on mainstream technology companies, right? And in this time period after the 2021 Capitol siege, 5 banks stopped working with GAB as well. And a bunch of other far-right websites were taken down and deplatformed in the same way as GAB was briefly in 2019. And this is what I found. So signups spiked dramatically. So again, the white line is where we would expect daily signups to be, right? Based on past observations. I think over 1,500 days of observations, right? So you can see the spike is quite dramatic, and it's mostly because other far-right platforms were taken offline. So GAB was one of the few far-right platforms starting, right? And it benefited from that. So that huge increase in signups is partially a response to media attention. But if you talk about survivability, I think a far-right platform's ability to leverage controversy is a sign of its power. And you might wonder, are we looking at real users? So maybe daily signups is not an ideal measure of a platform's ability to operate. For instance, I had 2 accounts myself because I studied the platform and I just forgot the password at some point. So I created a new account, right? And I'm not the only one in that situation, obviously, right? Journalists did the same thing, a bunch of academics, probably law enforcement as well. So having a raw count of members will not necessarily be a good measure of real member involvement, right? But I corrected for that, or controlled for that. So I looked at members who ended up posting at least 5 times, and I looked at members who later ended up posting at least 50 times to 100 times, and the measures are broadly the same. So member recruitment was unaffected by the deplatforming events. And I have additional evidence as well of the platform's survivability. So we know from financial statements, so GAB is a corporation, so it has to file financial statements to the SEC every year, and I did that in this particular time period. And we can tell from those reports that Gab had cash in the bank at the end of each year, okay? Moreover, Gab was online for most of that time period. So all this data in combination tells us that Gab overcame regulatory interventions. And I'll move on to the second platform that I'll talk about today. I'll cycle back to Gab in a few minutes, but for this second platform, we are going to talk about software development. We're going to talk about the development of two programs called ShadowSox and V2Ray, which really represent the first generation of sophisticated, in many cases, undetectable VPNs in China. So using those two programs, you can access the open internet in a way that is not detectable. And those two programs are not the only ones. They're not necessarily the best ones today, but they're still in use, and they were the first generation of that kind of software. And it started somewhere around this time in China, when the developer Cloudwindy released ShadowSox. And on GitHub, developers improved the program, they detected and fixed vulnerabilities, and they made it work with different devices and computer systems. And in 2015, V2Ray was developed by a developer with the pseudonym Victoria Raymond. And I mentioned that they were the first generation of sophisticated VPNs, undetectable VPNs, but they were not bulletproof. They are not bulletproof. So in 2015, the police located Cloudwindy and they ordered him to stop development. And in 2019, Victoria Raymond disappeared. So this is comparable to the deplatforming events when we talked about Gab, right? So recall that the question is, how do shadowy platforms operate in hostile regulatory environments? So did ShadowSox and V2Ray survive these hard interventions? To find out, I measured GitHub activity before and after the two events. And the first measure is the number of daily forks or code backups of each program. And I'll focus on ShadowSox just to save time. So here we're looking at daily forks of ShadowSox. So this is where the point where Cloudwindy announced that he had been contacted by the police and ordered to stop working on the code, right? And you can see that huge spike in forks on GitHub, right? And forking or the backing up of code, I think it's mostly an expression of solidarity. The practical utility of having thousands of backups of those two repositories are, I think it's more about expressing solidarity. But at the same time, forking demonstrates how difficult it is to stop code distribution, code sharing. Right? And recall that we're looking at whether these platforms were able, or these communities were able to survive the crackdowns, right? So a second measure is to look at how the development of ShadowSox and V2Ray, how the maintenance continued after the interventions. So here we're looking at GitHub commits from the two repositories. And Cloudwindy was ordered to stop working on ShadowSox here, right? And the yellow stuff is daily commits or monthly code commits to the ShadowSox repository. The blue stuff is V2Ray. And you can see that it continued for many, many years after those two original developers were unable to work on the code, right? And note that we're not looking at how many people use the code. We're looking at how many developers make additional contributions to the code, right? Minor and major contributions, right? So this is comparable to how if you work on a paper manuscript, maybe the second time you revise it, you make a bunch of edits, right? But if you have been working on a paper for many, many years, and it's the 16th iteration of that particular paper, the edits you will do will be minor, right? So the low activity here is more a measure of the quality of the code, I think. Another way to look at it is to look at the number of unique developers who were involved in maintaining the software. And we see the same thing again. So the decrease is not necessarily about the involvement sort of decreasing in a meaningful way. And finally, we have some evidence of Shutterstock's and V2Array's continued real-world relevance. So I think this is quite interesting. So in 2022, Shutterstock helped protesters in Iran. So this is a screen grab from the Farsi front page of Google. And you see there's a link to Outline VPN here. This is when the protests in Iran were approaching its peak in late 2022. And Outline VPN is Google's VPN. And the code in Outline VPN is Shutterstock's. So Google decided to use Shutterstock in its own VPN. Okay. And in 2024, I don't know if you're familiar with the Tor organization. It's a nonprofit organization that helps people access the open internet, and including other things. In 2024, Tor developers debated on whether they should start using the V2Array code in their program. Right? So these are just some examples of the real-world relevance of the two programs. Okay. So all this evidence suggests that Shutterstock and V2Array overcame interventions, right? So both of these platforms that I'm talking about were able to operate in their hostile regulatory environments. However, each domain is also shaped by what I call regulatory residuals. So this is where the criminology part of me comes in. But so what I mean by regulatory residuals is the practical, cultural, and cognitive obstacles that remain after a win in that contestation between regulation and pushback to that. So, for example, this is from Gab. Okay, so I talked about how different technology companies stopped working with Gab, right? And Gab figured out ways to survive, but it's still a hostile environment for Gab. So Gab is unable to sell its members to advertisers and raise funds that way, which is what Meta does and other big tech companies, right? And fundraising is possible, but it's for sure complicated because of the inability to make it easier for people to donate using credit cards and PayPal and Stripe and so on, right? So instead, Gab's organizational life is sustained by members donating through cryptocurrencies, sending snail mail donations as well. It is also able to raise funds by offering various online services and make commissions through those services. And Gab also has some financialization options for raising funds. I'll just give you one quick example of financialization. I think this is quite interesting. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but in 2012, the Obama administration made it easier for startup companies to raise funds without filing for an IPO. Basically, it lowered the threshold for making it possible for people to invest in their companies. Okay, and Gab is using that mechanism to raise funds from its members and others. So Gab can basically evaluate itself. We can say, And this is from one of the annual reports. The Gab says, we are worth about $250 million, we think, based on our membership base and the services we provide and so on. If you want to support Gab, you can buy shares in the company. You might not be able to sell those shares again or get the money back. We can't promise that. This is essentially what Gab said in its call for investors. And it has been able to raise about $4 million in that time period using this. So Gab's survivability is dependent on community building. It needs members to provide support, material support, right? And it's also sustained by performed legality. So I'll talk briefly about these two sides. So Gab builds community in part by framing its operations and its challenges as a collective struggle. And I'll give you one example of that. So this is from a newsletter, and Gab sends out newsletters to its members about every other day. This is from a newsletter from earlier this fall. The title of the newsletter is How We Will Win. I'll just read a quick excerpt from that. So, there's a palpable fear among our people that the great replacement will be the end of us. But you are not powerless. You hold the three most powerful weapons in this conflict: your voice, time, and wallet. These are the tools that God has given you to be a defender of your people and nation. So this is one example of how Gab builds community, right? This is a quantitative measure of how frequently Gab sends out these newsletters about every other day, as I said. And at the same time as Gab frames its challenges as a source of unity, it also performs legality, as I mentioned. And one example of that is how Gab in its financial reports oftentimes invoke the law. This is one example of that. Our mission is to build technology to support everyone, everywhere, to speak freely within the legal limits of the US Constitution. Now, moving back to the Chinese case, in that case, regulatory residuals shape censorship circumvention. So developers in their hostile regulatory environment, they also build community and perform legality. I'll just talk briefly about community building at first. So, for example, I mentioned that key developers like Cloud Windy and Victoria Raymond have been forced to stop working. And in response, you see things like the forking, which is a way to solve the problem of how do you maintain collaborative work when key designers are taken away, right? But you also see expressions of solidarity. This is just one example of how people express solidarity in response to Cloud Windy's resignation, or his forced resignation. I'm just going to show you a few comments from Cloud Windy's GitHub page. There are about 500 messages like these, and these are representative of what I found there. And community is also built by how developers demonstrate resilience by continuing dispassionate development of the same software. So the key leaders are snatched away, but the daily work continues. And like members of the Gab platform, actors also perform legality. So I talked to several developers about this, and they told me that this is one example of how they perform legality. So they keep money out of their work. This is in part to perform legality. So one person told me, developers believe that if they don't involve money, they will only receive a warning if discovered. And I heard similar things from numerous developers. And developers also downplay politics, so they don't frame what they do as a political act, which is quite different from GAP. So this is a quote from another developer. I believe in the open source spirit. My design should help as many people as possible. I'm not politically motivated. And I didn't even ask about politics, but they sort of brought this up when I asked what motivates you. They typically mention that it's not really about politics for them. And the software they develop tends to have apolitical names and is described in apolitical terms as well. Now, you might wonder, how is Shutterstock's and VT-Ray disseminated if developers reject commercializing their work? Well, I found that entrepreneurs step up and really fill that gap. I found that entrepreneurs, they create pre-configured VPNs, which are called airports, and they're called airports because the logo of Shutterstock is a paper plane. And entrepreneurs who provide airports, they also perform legality. I think this is just interesting. So oftentimes they ban political and illegal activities, even though the airports themselves are also illegal. And they foreground how they offer access to, let's say, American entertainment services. And they never really talk about politics. So they never say that if you use our airport, we will protect your identity, you can access free information, and join us to express your political views. You never see any kind of framing like that. And also, airports typically remain small despite being scalable. So the services they provide will be easy to scale, but they remain small in part, I think, to avoid unnecessary attention. So for all these different reasons, the airport market is fragmented, it's in many ways inefficient, but it's also resilient. And one way to visualize this market is something like this. So you have a small number of developers in the low thousands. So Cloud Windy and Victoria Raymond would be in this group, right? And you have a larger numbers of airport developers and airport providers. And of course, you have a much higher number of users, right? Happy to talk about how I came out with the numbers here, by the way, but it's quite tricky to measure, as you can imagine. Okay, so we're reaching the end of the presentation here. So we've seen how both domains overcame interventions, very different kinds of interventions, but they overcame them nonetheless. And we also seen that how their newfound agency is shaped by regulatory residuals. We've seen how actors mimic the dominant institutions they challenge to navigate these regulatory residuals. For instance, by filing detailed annual reports which invoke free speech laws, that's like the case from GAP, right? Or by limiting and censoring political talk. So this is a kind of isomorphic contestation, right? And I have these different cases to help us think more abstractly about what platform technology does, right? So one sort of ongoing question in the literature is, what do platforms do, right? And in the underground, I find that platforms, they support broadcasting of frames, so people can frame their own activities and what they are doing. And we also see how actors are able to collaborate and raise funds and perform what they do on a large scale as well. I also found that the platforms themselves are performative. So for instance, Gap presents itself as the main alternative to Silicon Valley, which centralizes power, right? Whereas in the case of Shutterstock and V2Ray, we see how the GitHub platform makes it easy to share code, which decentralizes power, and there are many independent teams, and you have many breakaway teams, and you have numerous alternatives to the two softwares that I've talked about. All right, so let's end it there. I'm grateful for your attention. Thank you very much. I'm open to your questions. Thank you so much.